and welcome to Classics Confidential. I'm Anastasia and I'm talking with Konstantinos Nikoloutsos of St. Joseph's University in America. Welcome, Konstantinos. In your paper about Electra Garrigó by the Cuban playwright Piñera, you discuss this fascinating reception. Would you like to tell us why it is an important play in the chain of receptions of Sophocles' Electra?
Well, Electra Garrigó is an adaptation of an ancient tragedy, and at the same time it marks the beginning of modernism in Cuban theater. Piñera wrote the play in 1941 when he was 29, 30 years old. Yet the play wasn't staged until 1948, and through this play he attempted to redefine, to refigure the Cuban stage. There have been, at the time, there were some performances of ancient drama starting in 1940 with Antigone, which was staged by the students at the University of Havana. As a matter of fact, the promotional poster mentions that that was the first time Antigone was put on stage in Latin America. To what extent this is accurate or not, I cannot really say, but what is important about this performance of Antigone is that it created, it led to performances of other dramas such as Iphigenia at Tauris, Hecuba, Oedipus King, etc. So these were restages, performances of classical drama in Spanish translation. What Piñera does differently is he writes a play, he writes the story of Electra by situating it in a Cuban setting. And what was so fascinating, of course we say that nowadays in the year 2014, back in 1948, the reception of the play was different. What's so fascinating about this play is that it is the first play, to my knowledge, in which Agamemnon is not dead. Agamemnon, the nuclear family is still intact and under one roof. Agamemnon is there on stage. We have Clytemnestra, who has a lover, Aegisthus, but has not sent Orestes away. Orestes is another character in the play. And again, what is so absurdist is that Sophocles' tutor appears in the form of a centaur, who, I mean, the play is set in the porch of a colonial style house. We have 6 columns which are reminiscent of an ancient temple, and the center trots from one side of the porch to the other, advising, urging, let's say, Electra to make her own revolution. Now, if we try to examine this play, to situate in its artistic context, we see that Piñera tried to create a new theater by going back to the origins of the Western tradition. In other words, his play constitutes a rupture with Spanish tradition, the most recent tradition, and one could say that his approach to tradition, to the Western canon, is Janus phase. In other words, he looks forward by looking backwards. But when the play was staged in 1948, allegedly one critic left the theater, calling the play a spiteful thrown at Olympus. But the reaction was so hostile that the play was removed from the index of plays performed in Havana in that year, in 1948. But the play was staged again in 1958 and 2 years later in 1960. And the reception was totally different because the political situation in Cuba had changed. In 1948, Batista was the dictator, and one of the things that the play did was to interrogate the institution of family that the Constitution of 1940 put under legal protection for the first time in the history of the Cuban nation of post-independence Cuba. In 1958, a year before the revolution of 1959, the reception of the play was different because the audience was invited to make connections between the past and their present and see Agamemnon as a figure for Batista, as a dictatorial figure, and Aegisthus as someone who is trying to put the dictator, the patriarch, to death. As a matter of fact, we can see the centaur who urges Electra to make her own revolution as a figure for Fidel Castro, who was nicknamed El Caballo, the horse.
That's actually very interesting because Edith Hall has talked about the radicalization of Greek tragedy from the sort of 60s onwards, and yet Piñera's reception predates that. So something very exciting was happening in Cuba, in Latin America more generally, that perhaps we were not as familiar with. So what was the impact, what was the afterlife of Piñera's play?
Well, until the year 1961, when Piñera was arrested in a government crackdown on prostitution and homosexuality, Piñera was one of the playwrights, the authors of the revolution, and he was a prominent, not to say the towering figure of Cuban theater. What follows the 1958 performance of Electra Garrigó is a play titled Medea in the Mirror by Jose Triana, who considered, I should say considers because Triana is still alive in Paris, Piñera his mentor. Electra Garrigó was directed by Francisco Morin, a Cuban director who studied in the 30s in New York, and then went back to Cuba. He established a theater group called Prometeo, and the name is absolutely, and then the name. He chose this name because to indicate his rupture with tradition, what followed before the formation of the group, in that we had a lot of plays in Cuba that were reproductions of the Spanish buffo and the zarzuela, which was it's a light opera that was very popular in Cuba and the Philippines. As a matter of fact, the zarzuela in Cuba follows its own reception path. Francisco Morin, who directed Electra Garrigó for the first time in 1948 and then in 1958, encouraged Triana to write a play based on Medea. Of course, Triana happened to be in Paris at the time, and before he moved to Paris, he was in Spain, and he was exposed to some Spanish and French rewritings of Medea. That's another influence there. So in 1960, Jose Triana wrote, in 1959-1960, Triana wrote Medea in the Mirror, which was staged by Prometeo at the Sala Teatro Prometeo, and it was directed by Francisco Morena. That's a very influential play in the history of Cuban theater. And then a few years later, we have a third rewriting of classical drama, Los Siete contra Tebas, the Seven Against Thebes, by Anton Arufat. So one could say that Piñera establishes a tradition by rewriting the myth of Electra in a Cuban setting. Of course, I wouldn't like to say that Electra Garrigó is a recreation of Sophocles' play. One can see the influence of all three ancient versions of Electra. That's why I use the term a recreation of the story of Electra. And after hearing your paper, now I can see the influence of some contemporary Electras on Piñera, such as O'Neill's play.
Well, thank you very much for talking about this really exciting Cuban recreation of the myth of Electra, in which we share an interest, of course. So thank you very much,
You're
Konstantinos.
very welcome. Thank you.